So in this particular section, we're going to talk a little bit more about relationships and love. I've posted a delightful video from Helen Fisher, who's a cultural anthropologist who talks about research that she's done on love and lost love. It's a lovely video. I'm going to summarize some of the main points for you here so that you can kind of capture the most important parts of her talk. But I highly recommend that you watch it. It's something that I tend to never get tired of seeing. So in the Helen Fisher study, they took a photograph of a significant other or a photograph of someone that had recently broken up with the participant and displayed it in an fMRI machine and took a look at brain activation when seeing this particular photograph compared to a photograph of a neutral other. They also did a distracting task in between in order to make sure that there wasn't any order effects or leaking from the various conditions into different conditions. And one of the things that she found is that when people saw pictures of those they loved or those that they had recently been broken up with, there was a big activation in the ventral tegmental area, which is associated with dopamine production. We associate dopamine with seeking reward, with desire, with wanting. She identifies specifically the A10 cells that are once again a central factory for dopamine production. She also mentions the nucleus accumbens. She doesn't refer to it by name, but she refers to a part of the brain that calculates gains and losses, and how the nucleus accumbens is especially activated in people who are recently broken up with. So people who are recently broken up with tend to have a great increase in their risk-taking and their tendency to want to gamble big in order to potentially regain the subject of their affection. Here's just some of the neurotransmitters involved in the chemistry of love. So dopamine, as I've said before, is associated with reward. It's also associated with motivation, attention, focus. Oxytocin is a social hormone that's associated with intense bonding and trusting. So people who are in an active, loving relationship tend to have a high amount of oxytocin in their system, and people who've recently been broken up with might be going through a bit of withdrawal. Norepinephrine is associated with arousal and vigilance. When Helen Fisher talks, she talks about how being in love can be overwhelming and all-consuming, as well as being broken up with, and how people who are in that state can really have an increased level of arousal and vigilance and think of nothing else but the person that they are deeply attracted to. People in love have difficulty sleeping and eating. Think the classic Romeo and Juliet, right? That didn't end terribly well. We see also people who've recently been broken up with tend to have lowered serotonin, which is associated with impulsivity and obsessive thoughts. They can't stop thinking about the person in question, and they tend to not think about the consequences of their actions. And of course, people who've recently been broken up with also had a surge of cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So you can see how when we're madly in love with someone, we tend to have a soup of hormones and neurotransmitters in our system that tend to increase our focus and attention on that person and tend to kind of make us not pay attention to other things. And that when we're broken up with, sometimes that can still be around and have a different sort of focus in terms of impulsivity and calculating gains and risks. All right, let's talk about different theories of love. So first we have Sternberg's triangular theory of love. You can imagine a triangle with 3 points, and there are 3 different qualities that Sternberg talks about that exist in different qualities, or quantities rather. So there's intimacy, and in this particular case, so intimacy would be the top point of the pyramid. We don't think about intimacy as being sexually intimate with someone. We think of intimacy as knowing someone very well and liking them. Passion, which is one of the bottom points of the triangle, is where we start getting into sexual connection and attractiveness. And commitment is the other point of the triangle, our sense of wanting to stay committed with the person we're in a relationship with. Now, one of the reasons I like Sternberg so much is because he talks about how these things can work in combination with one another, and he recognizes a wide range of relationships, not just relationships with a significant romantic other. So to go through each of these in just a little bit more detail, we can think of intimacy as deep friendship and liking, which is marked by a reciprocal exchange of personal information. So you're both telling one another deep and personal things. The person in question is responsive to the other person's needs, and there's a sense of empathy and understanding. Passion is that sexual desire, intense longing, strong feelings, infatuation, and physical arousal. Whereas commitment is a sense of dedication to a person or dedication to a relationship. So one of the things that I like about Sternberg, once again, is that he goes through these different combinations that can exist. So first we think of the triangle with intimacy at the top and passion and commitment at either of the two edges of the bottom. And we can think about these as being completely independent from one another. So sometimes you can be in a relationship that only has intimacy. Sometimes you can be in a relationship that only has commitment. And sometimes you can be in a relationship that only has passion. So we call a relationship that only has intimacy to be a state of liking. We call a relationship that only has commitment and doesn't have any intimacy or passion empty love. And we call passion without intimacy or commitment infatuation. When passion is combined with intimacy, that would be a sense of romantic love. So those first few honeymooning sort of months where you're getting to know someone very well and you feel that spark, but you don't necessarily have a sense of deep commitment to that person yet. That would be a state of what Sternberg would call romantic love. Intimacy combined with commitment would be what Sternberg would call companionate love. So when you have a very close, dear friend that you don't necessarily feel passion for, but you know and like very well and seek to fulfill one another's needs, and you have a strong sense of commitment to, where you want to keep up that friendship and put in the work that it requires, once again, that would be companionate love. And passion combined with commitment, but without intimacy, would be fatuous love. So this is where somebody feels a strong emotional and physical connection to someone else and has a strong sense of commitment to them, but doesn't necessarily know them very well and doesn't know enough about them to know their preferences or needs. My favorite example of fatuous love would be Romeo and Juliet, where they immediately had a spark of connection with one another and desired one another very strongly, and immediately also jumped into marriage. But Romeo didn't know Juliet's favorite flavor of ice cream. They didn't have enough time to get to know one another that well. According to Sternberg, when you have all three, passion and intimacy and commitment, he would call this consummate love, which to him was the highest form of love. Now, of course, I would argue that passion is not necessary for everyone. Some people, for example, might identify as asexual. Some people might have taken a vow of celibacy, in which case passion is just not in the cards or not central to their identity. So it's important to know that this is Sternberg's perception of ultimate love and not necessarily everyone's experience. Here's a really interesting sort of thing to think about. There are a few different types of relationships. I'm going to go ahead and break down the two most common ones, and let's think about them a little bit more. So an exchange relationship is one that tends to be based on reciprocity and fairness. If you'll remember, reciprocity is if I do a favor for you, you have to do a favor for me. In an exchange relationship, you expect immediate and equal repayment, and when there is inequity, it tends to lead to a feeling of discomfort. Oh, I bought this coffee, you're going to get the next one. You know, that tends to be assumed in an exchange relationship. Exchange relationships don't often just exist with romantic relationships. They can also exist with any number of relationships where you're where you're requesting a specific thing from someone else and they give it to you and you give them some sort of repayment for it. So, for example, a relationship I have with my person who cuts my hair is an exchange-based relationship. She cuts my hair, I give her money for it, and we're both satisfied with that level of relationship. But some romantic relationships can also be exchange-based, where it's a tit for tat, where each one person keeps track of what they are owed and is focused on reciprocity and fairness. A communal relationship is based on a sense of mutual concern. So rather than expecting a certain amount of repayment coming your way, you would be looking out for the other person and taking care of them and not necessarily keeping track of what you are owed. There's no expectation of immediate repayment. The thought is it'll all even out in the long term, or this person needs my help right now. I don't care if I don't ever get paid back. So people in communal relationships don't tend to keep track of who owes whom. They tend to focus on the needs of that other person in the relationship and keep it at that. As a result, people in communal relationships feel less pressure to repay immediately and in full when a favor is done for them. The thought will be, of course, that it balances out over time. This is one of those very fun studies where I think, oh gosh, that's clever. I wish I'd come up with that. So in a study that they did on exchange and communal relationships, they had couples work on puzzles together. And what they did was they had them complete puzzles, and basically they would give the puzzle to one of the couple, and then after a few minutes they'd ask them to switch to the other member of the couple to complete the puzzle. And the person who got the partially completed puzzle had a chance to pick the color of pen that they would use to complete the puzzle. You could pick either a pen that was a different color or a pen that was the same color as the one your partner was using to start the puzzle. And what the research showed is that people in communal relationships were more likely to pick a pen that was the same color, so that it was impossible to tell which person had completed which part of the puzzle. It all looked like it had been completed as a communal effort. Whereas people in exchange relationships were more likely to pick different colored pens, so that it was very clear who had done what. And communal relationships tend to be just a little bit more successful in the long run. Here are some reasons why. People in communal relationships tend to help one another a little bit more. They tend to feel better about helping one another because that's the goal. The goal is to make the other person feel happy. And if both of you are doing that, it tends to work out well for everybody. People in communal relationships tend to be more responsive to the other person. And they tend to be more focused on that other person's needs rather than their own actions. People in communal relationships tend to have a greater sense of unity and shared identity. They're more likely to use we statements instead of I statements when talking about their relationship. When it comes to the last topic, we're going to talk a little bit about attachment styles. So Bowlby developed a sense of attachment styles by looking at infant behavior, and he translated that to potential attachment styles for adults. He identified two different dimensions, one of which is anxiety, which is the attitudes we have toward ourselves. The other is avoidance, which is the attitudes we have towards the other person. And there's basically 4 different combinations that we can express. Now we're going to talk about this as it applies to adult relationships. So you can have low anxiety and low avoidance, which means you feel good about yourself and you feel good about other people. That would be a type of relationship known as secure attachment. With secure attachment, you would trust your partner, you would share feelings with one another and not hold back. And people with secure attachment tend to report having more satisfying and intimate relationships. When there's high anxiety and low avoidance, you tend to feel bad about yourself, but you don't want to leave the other person. You tend to want to be close to them. This is anxious, ambivalent attachment. And oftentimes, people in these relationships tend to enjoy closeness to extremes. They can be identified as overly clingy. So they don't care about themselves, They're a little bit down on themselves, and they want to be very close to the other person. People in these types of relationships often fear that they will be abandoned. They might use sex as a tool in order to keep their partner around. And they might answer this on a questionnaire of attachment styles. I'm afraid that I will lose my partner's love. That's an example of one of the questions that measures anxious attachment. This is another one of the questions. I often wish that my partner's feelings for me were as strong as my feelings for him or her. There can be an imbalance in the sense of neediness. High anxiety and high avoidance is a challenge. This is where someone feels bad about themselves and they also don't particularly care for other people. So this would be fearful avoidant attachment, where you have a low opinion of yourself and desire to keep others at arm's length. Typically, you see others as untrustworthy and yourself as unlovable. It's thought that some of these patterns of attachment can develop as a result of early childhood connection with a parental figure. And once again, that can lead to certain patterns when it comes to an inability to trust others or to disclose personal information, or the thoughts and feelings that you might have about yourself and your self-worth. And of course, the last combination is low anxiety, high avoidance, where someone might feel fairly good about themselves but doesn't really trust other people. This would be dismissing avoidant attachment, where they see themselves as worthy, but they want to prevent relationships from being too close. So they might not self-disclose a great deal or trust the other person or desire commitment. They tend to value self-reliance. And here are some sample items from avoidant attachment. I prefer to not be too close to romantic partners. It's easy for me to be affectionate with my partner is measuring the opposite. So people who say yes are not avoidant. All right, one of the last things we're going to be talking about is Caroline Rusbolt, who developed a theory to explore why people stay in long-term relationships successfully and the different qualities of that relationship. So this is the last theory of love and relationships we're going to explore in this unit. So Rusbolt studied long-term relationships over years and measured various qualities and then used that data to create what she called the investment model. And basically there are different components that can determine whether a long-term relationship will be successful. The first is partner satisfaction. The second is quality of available alternatives. So for example, if you live in a rural area and there's not that many other people who you might want to date, your quality of available alternatives would be fairly low. If you live in an area that's got a dense, youthful, vibrant population with a lot of potential folks in that dating pool, your quality of available alternatives might be a little higher. And then there's how much is invested in the relationship. Oh, also keep in mind, quality of available alternatives is a matter of perception. Degree of investment in relationship means how much time, energy, money has been invested, and the more you've invested, the more committed you are. So this is related to the commitment principle that we talked about with Cialdini, where if you've committed, then it's very hard for you to sometimes walk away from something that you've invested a lot of time, energy, and effort into. So sometimes abusive relationships will capitalize on this. People who are in abusive relationships often report that even though they have incredibly low satisfaction, that they've often been isolated from other people, which means that they aren't exposed to any available alternatives, and often it's very difficult for them to leave because they've invested a lot in their relationship. When it comes to ways to cope, if relationships are having a challenge, for example, the easiest and best way is to increase partner satisfaction. Oftentimes, though, people who are attempting to salvage a relationship will devalue the alternatives that are available. I would say the best thing to do is increase your own appeal and focus on your partner satisfaction.